Just like yesterday, my guess is what we're going to do right now is we're going to go over the two examples that are at the end of the chapter for chapter 18. When we get done with that, we're going to go over chapter 19 and then look at the examples for that. I sent an email to Evan and Paul this morning asking them about the classes for fall. In other words, Angie, you'll be taking the AWD1100 class, and are we still going to use the same books we used this semester? I believe we are, but I wanted a verification of that. And for you, Keegan, for the AWD1111 class, is the class indeed going to be a Node.js class, or is it going to remain an ASP.NET class? There were supposed to be a couple times this past semester that we were supposed to get together, the three of us, myself and Evan and Paul, to discuss stuff for fall and for spring of next year. But, you know, with the way that things are today, of course, we're not. And it's also very interesting. I don't know if you both have seen this, but they're talking next week about starting to open up Missouri. You know, we all have our own thoughts on that. Whether or not that's a good thing, I don't know. But one of the last places they're talking about opening up is St. Louis and St. Louis County, because they've been the hardest hit with the number of cases in this pandemic. So the reason I'm telling you that is I have no idea if hopefully they're going to answer my email and let me know what's going on. But Paul was supposed to be coming out almost daily to the Wentzville campus to meet with me, and we were going to redo the AWD 1111 class. All right. I don't know if that's still a go or if that's not a go. He had talked about using a series of videos from this gentleman where he's taken classes from, and so have I. And the guy is very good. But the problem always is, in my opinion, when you have a class and in that class you don't have a textbook, it's very hard, I think. Even if these videos are really good, it would be nice to get some kind of a textbook that we would have that would go along with that. I think what you'll find, Angie, is for the AWD 1000 class in fall, that again, the textbooks are from the same publisher as your C# book. So you can already tell what the good things about them are. They're pretty thorough. Usually on every page on the right, they give you examples, etc. And some people like that, some people don't like that. But if they get back to me today, I'm going to get back to you tomorrow to let you know what's going on. All right. Or if they get back to me today or by the end of the week, let's put it that way. The plan right now, and I just want to make sure that you do know this, is that I'm going to lecture today. I'm going to lecture tomorrow. I'm going to lecture on Thursday. And on Friday, we'll have just, again, a little bit of a primer on how to use Mobirise. And then after that, next week, you're on your own. Now, what we have been doing for this is literally, I do get together with you for about 5 minutes at the beginning of class. Just say, are there any questions, etc. And I'm doing that for attendance purposes. Does that make sense to both of you?
Yes.
Okay, so all I'm saying is next week, the plan is, unless something changes, and I don't anticipate it changing, is next Monday and Tuesday and Wednesday that we'll get together like this at 8:05, and by no later than 8:15, you'll be basically, I'll say, okay, that's it, talk to you tomorrow. And like I said, I would like to get some definitive answer for both of you by a week from tomorrow as far as books for fall. You know, I'm not saying that you're going to buy the books now, but it's at least nice to know what's going on. If there's any updates on anything, it's at least nice to know what's going on. If anybody has any idea, I mean, I have been told they're planning on starting summer school courses in school on June 1st. I don't know if that's still a go or not. So, I mean, I would like to hear some of this stuff so I can let you two know what's going on. All right, end of that. Now, you actually have the code for this, whether you realized it or not. And if you right mouse click and you choose view code on here, again, it's very simplistic. And this is all I wanted to show you on here is when you look, again, this, when you come in there and you bring in the data view grid control that you see on there, you get this line. This is, again, using this adapter, we want you to fill that grid view control, and we want you to use from this database, we want you to use the data set, meaning we want you to use the states table. All right. And although this gets put in for us, I think, to my knowledge, we can put anything we want in there. In other words, all right, in the state thing, I don't believe that they put any checks in. That's what chapter 19 is about. Okay, so when I click on this, and I know we had our issues with this yesterday, so hopefully you can see the run when I make the run here, but I'm not sure if you'll be able to or not, and for some reason, nothing's coming up. Well, let me try it again and see if it comes up. Did before because I ran it earlier today. Well, that's interesting. But the idea is it literally just brings up the table of states. All right. And what I wanted you to understand about that is not only does it bring in that table of states, but you can go in there and you can remove a state, you can add a state, you can modify a state. Wow, this is interesting. Like I said, this was not doing this before. Should still have my database and stuff should still be in here. Let's try this. Well, I'm getting error messages where this ran just a little bit ago. It's not running right now. And it's telling me I've got an incompatibility with my database. All right. I'm not sure what the problem is. All right. The point is, what I did want to show you on this was just the fact that we actually had a working RDBMS, Relational Database Management System, literally with 4 lines of code. All right. And I think that you both understand that well enough, hopefully at least, that it makes sense. And the other example that was in here, let me get that one up. Was the product example here. And again, the idea is same kind of thing. There's all your code. Those 3 lines, that 1 line. So what they did in this example is it was basically the same thing that we did yesterday with customers, but rather than doing it with customers, we're doing it with products. So we can go in there and we can change the product name. We can change, or any of the things with it, with the exception of they set up the product ID, which is the primary key. In this example, they set it up as a label, meaning that you weren't able to change it. All right. Like I said, I apologize. I ran this earlier and it worked just fine. So I'll have to go and take a look at it, I guess, again later. But let's just do this. I'm going to jump right into chapter 19. All right. I was looking at some of the later chapters this morning. So All right. So chapter 19 talks about two major categories. One is bound controls and one is parameterized queries. Now, with bound controls, you've already looked at them in the last chapter. The difference is, you may or may not have realized this, every single thing that we did in the last chapter, everything. So in other words, if we had in there product name, product description, or if we had name, address, city, state, zip, every single thing that was put in there was put in as a string. All right. And it was done that way, I believe, at least for a reason. And that is so that when they talk about bound controls in this chapter, in chapter 20, they can talk about changes you have to make in order to be able to work with controls that are not strings. All right. So for instance, let's say that you've got a zip code, but you put it in as integers, or a salary field. All right. Or fields like that. So they mention that. Okay. Says we'll learn how to work with bound controls, and then we'll go into parameterized queries. I believe I've talked a little bit about parameterized queries, but I want to say it again, and that is, with the parameterized query, the idea is as the program is running, you're able to ask questions. All right. So it's kind of like the difference between, let's assume, for example, not a great analogy because of what's happening in the world, but at the beginning of let's assume we had the beginning of the baseball season. All right. And at the beginning of the baseball season, you ask, who do you think is going to be in the World Series, type of an idea. Well, you're probably going to get a different answer if you ask somebody that question and you ask them that before the season starts, and you ask them the same question halfway into the season, because things happen. Players get injured, players get traded, etc. In the same kind of way, when you work with parameterized queries, the idea is as the program is running, you are able to formulate queries. And a lot of times what will happen with these is you'll do a query based on something, and that will lead you to information you didn't know about, which could actually lead you to more queries. And I believe I've said this to you before, but a lot of times these are the type of queries that, for example, if you're a database person working for a bigger company and you have a marketing department, marketing might be the people who come in here and start saying to you which products are selling particularly well, which products are not selling particularly well, etc. All right, then we'll look at the tool strip control, an enhanced customer maintenance application, how to work with the data grid view, and a customer invoice application. I believe, again, I've sent you those two programs for chapter 19. So my guess is what we will do is we will, this probably going through most of chapter 19 here will take till the first time when my Zoom runs out. And then we'll take a look afterwards. We'll take a look at some of the programs, and that'll probably be it for the day. All right. So as it says, how to work with bound text boxes and combo boxes. I am taking for granted, all right, that as an example, you all know what a combo box is. It's one of these right here where you click on it and boom, it shows you a bunch of different possibilities. That's a combo box. This is a list box. All right. But the idea is, if you've got any field, so in this field, they've got unit price. You know as well as I do that even though when you print out unit price, if you put it into a text box, for example, you put it in as a string and you format it for currency, still, if you want to actually be able to do queries and the like on it, you've got to use it as though it is a numeric field. So what they're saying in here is you are able to come in here and apply formatting. So this is the kind of formatting that you would do to a non-string field. All right. So as an example here, a string would have no formatting typically. There'd be no reason for it. Now, if you've got a number here like unit price, we could put in there numeric. And numeric would typically mean it could have numbers, it could have a decimal place, it could have numbers before and after the decimal place. But you couldn't do any formatting, any other formatting. In other words, it wouldn't be expected, unless you added it here, that you would have the number of places after the decimal, whether or not you could have a comma, etc. But the big thing is, and I'm sure you realize that the difference between this and this is with a currency, it can have a dollar sign. And currency will automatically set the decimal places to 2. You can change that if you want and make it 0. All right, and there may be a reason for doing that. You also notice in here, there are 3 other ones. There's date time, and when you put in date time, you've got your choice. You can put in just the date, you can put in just the time, you can put in both. And when you put in dates and times, there are different ways that you can format them. All right, for instance, you might say for today, you might have the word Tuesday, and then afterwards, you might have it say April 28th, 2020. Or you might just have 4-28-2020, or even something as simple as 4/28/20. All right? And those are all different ways that you can go in and you can format. All right. Now, this is the formatting. There is other stuff that you can do in here. All right. For instance, if you want to change the background color, give it a border, those typically you don't talk about as much, because what we're getting to in here are more of the numeric fields, the date fields, etc. Scientific, typically, unless you are working in a laboratory, that's not going to be that big a thing. You can use logarithmic notation, what's called big E notation, and there's a few other things you can do. Finally, custom, and that one actually can be important. So for instance, let's just suppose that I've got some kind of a product number, and it's a combination of letters and digits, but it has to be a certain length. It maybe has to start with a letter and end with a digit, must have maybe 7 letters and 6 digits or something like that. All right. So that's what they get into in here. So as it says, you can select the text box you want, and you can expand on the data bindings. We'll look at that in just a little bit. All right. So as it says, to apply the format, you select the format you want to use. That's what we just looked at. Okay. All right. How to bind it to a data source. It's one thing to set this stuff up. It's another thing that when you run it, the system is smart enough that it knows to go out to a certain database and grab, all right, a certain field. So if you look at the example that's right here, there we've got its state is what they're talking about. Here's the data source, and notice what we're doing. We're saying what we want to display here is the state name. For instance, MISSOURI. But that doesn't mean that's exactly what you're going to store in the database. Where it says value member, that typically is what you display in the database. So you might want the word Missouri to actually show on screen, but what you want to actually be put in the database is MO. So you can set up your own binding source in order to do that. And this is what's in there. Again, you can see some of these properties as we looked at yesterday. So the data source, as it says, that's the name of the table that contains what you're looking for. And you look at this, you go, well, it says state binding source. So that's not a table. No, the state binding source is what gets bound to whatever this table is right here. It's probably customer table. All right, display member, I already mentioned to you, it's what you want to have show. Value member is what you actually want to store again in the database. And selected value, as mentioned, gets the value of the currently selected item. That's one thing when you start working with drop-down lists, all right? And that's, if you go back and look at the examples that we did last week, when we had, for example, the customer, and then we had the customer last name, comma, first name. I was constantly doing stuff with combo boxes where I was using the selected value. All right. As you probably guess, two things about this. First, this is going to involve the use of code. Because when you come in here and you start doing this, the idea is what we want to do is we want some of our own control over what's going on here. All right. So I'm not going to read these to you, but if you look at these things that are right here, in a way at least, some of the ones that are in here that are new, you've already seen. You saw the plus sign yesterday for an add new type of thing. So you saw some of that. But the other thing too is when you see the arrow that points to the right, that means move to the next record. If you have the arrow that points to the right that has a line after the end of the arrow, all right, that means move to the last record. And the same kind of way, if you reverse it, it's move to first, or move to previous and move to first. That's one thing. The other thing that you'll see in just a minute is virtually all the time that you do this, because what we're talking about doing now is moving around inside of a database. This is a real easy way to have things go wrong or things happen that you don't think are going to happen. What does that mean? That means that when you start to do this stuff, you start using a lot of try-catch blocks, because it's quite possible that something can go wrong that you didn't plan on happening. All right. So it says the binding source ensures that all controls that are bound to the same table are synchronized. What does that mean? It means that when you move from row to row, that you get all the values for that row. I mean, imagine, as an example, with the 4 of you that are still at least signed up to be in this class, all right, I don't think that probably either one of you would like it if I changed from one name to another, and rather than it changing and showing me that your associated grades, it showed me somebody else's grades. All right. If a form provides for updating the rows in a table, moving from one row to another causes any changes made in the current row to be saved. In other words, there is more or less an auto save that's set up in here. All right. When you add a new row using the add new method, the position property is set to be one more than the position of the last row in the data table. I showed you that a little bit yesterday when we looked at that customer example, and it had 696 listings in there. When I put myself in, it was 697. Finally, you can use end edit and cancel edit to save or cancel changes in an existing row. Now, when you move off the row, it should do this end edit for you. All right, it should automatically go in typically and save for you. So then parameterized queries. All right, it says you'll learn one way to create parameterized queries for your forms. There almost always, when you start coming in here and doing this stuff, is more than one way of doing the same thing. All right. So it says for some applications, like the product maintenance presented in the last chapter, it's acceptable or even preferable to fill the table in the data set with every row in the database table. However, it says if there's many of them, you might not want everything. You might not want every column. So with a parameterized query, what you're able to do is just select the information that you want. All right. And it looks a little bit hinky here. All right. But the key thing is that @ sign that's right there. And what that is saying is, for example, I might have a drop-down list of customer names. And when I choose that name, give me the ID, the name, the address, the city, the state, and the zip for that customer. That is a parameterized query. So in a way, when we worked on those queries and we did this, we were using the equivalent of what happens in the background for one of these queries, but we didn't make them parameterized. The reason I didn't use those is we hadn't talked about them. And I figured that would be a little bit harder for you to understand. All right. When you do that, you're typically going to get something like this. What's the difference? Well, a couple things. First of all, you'll notice right here, we can put in any customer ID we want. So regardless of how many there are, there's 100 customers, we can put number 100 in here. So 100 will go right there. And for customer 100, you'll get their name, address, city, state, and zip. Plus, as you can see in here, we have now set this as a dropdown, right? Which is a little bit nicer, okay? And it can lead for things that are, it can make it a little bit faster. All right. Now, would it be possible for you to have drop downs, for example, for city? Yeah. But think of how many cities Texas has. Think of how many zip codes Texas has. All right. But there are at least times, maybe you've had this happen to you before. I have had, it doesn't happen as much today, but in the past, when I was living at a certain address I was at in Illinois, when I first moved there, I was getting called daily, and I'm not exaggerating, from telemarketers, sometimes several times a day. And if I would choose to answer one of them, they would ask me what my zip code was. I would tell them at the time it was 61072. And they said, oh, I just want to verify you're in Rockton, Illinois, right? Okay, because they could tell that based on that. That you can program in if you want. Even that, when you start to think about how many zip codes there are in the country, that's a bit of work. All right. So the author says here you can add a parameterized query to a table using the search criteria builder dialog box. That's this. All right. So how to use code to work with this? Again, I started mentioning this before. You'll notice try catch, try catch. This is where things can go wrong. Not only can they go wrong, but I would tell you that more often than not, especially when you're first starting, they will go wrong. Something will end up happening. All right. Some of this code will be generated for you. And it's not that different from the stuff we saw before, except that when you are working with certain fields in here, it's got to know, for example, for the customer ID, the type of field that you're working with. That's got to be cast as an int, for example. And as always, try to do this. If it fails, just give me a message box, and in that message box, put in the system message that arises. And you'll also notice in this case, we're catching a system exception in here. A system exception is more generic in nature than an SQL exception. And in the second example, it's just exception. Exception is more general or generic than system exception. What some programmers do, because you can have as many catch statements in here as you want to or need to have. So what you have to use the most specific, and you've got to work your way down to the least specific. So if you've got a lot of things that can conceivably go wrong in here, you might catch maybe 10 different kinds of exceptions. But for a lot of developers, what they do is the last one is always this one, which says, hey, if you find anything that looks out of whack, all right, and you haven't found it above, catch it with this exception. So again, as it says, you will get that code pretty much written for you, but you can modify it to make it easier to read, to change the way it works. If you want to have something happen that's not currently happening, more or less. All right. Then they get into talking about the tool strip control. And as the author says, although the toolbar Visual Studio generates for a parameterized query works well if it's simple, when you've got a more complex type of query, when you've got a lot of different things you're looking for, it becomes kind of a pain. All right. So there is a customized toolbar that you can use. My 10-minute warning just came up, so we won't finish this, but we will finish it in the next part of the lecture. So it says to work with items on a tool strip control, you use what's called the items collection editor. All right. This doesn't look that different from like the properties window. that we dealt with before. But when you look in here, okay, hopefully when you take a quick look, notice it says label here, and it's got an A there signifying that it's a label. If we had that one highlighted, we could go in and set the font for it. We could set, you know, whatever text we wanted to have in there, etc. So what they're saying in this items collection editor, a real good example would be like when we talked about having that in the example that we went over in class last week where we had city, state, zip. We had that all in one label. That's something that you might want to do in a thing like the items collection editor. So these are some of the common properties. I'm not going to read them to you. You'll notice also it's even possible to put images in there. Why would you want to do that? Well, you know, if it's a product table that you're working with in here, maybe you do want a product image. All right, you've got a small picture of a product that you want to show. And again, as it says, how to code an event handler. Well, this is the kind of thing that you're going to get. Okay, now if you click here, the idea is you put a customer name in there and you click here, you get information about just that customer. If you leave that blank and you click here, you get as many customers on the screen as will show at one time. All right. And you'll notice, again, try catch. This is the cancel. There's no try catch there. That just says that basically if you click this cancel button, just get out of here. Have that close, for lack of better words. The get all, well, what do we have to do in there? We have to make sure that it comes in just like we did with that states example and that products example earlier. We wanted to do a fill. So we wanted to go out to the customers table right there, and we wanted to fill that data set, all right, with everything that's in the customer table. And if you can't, give us an error. As opposed to an individual customer. All right, now think about this, because there's a little bit more code in here than maybe we're even used to. And that is, when you look at this, that's expecting that we put something in here. So we've got to check to make sure it's not empty. We also have to check to make sure two other things. Number one, if it's supposed to be an ID, that it is a number. And finally, we have to check that it's a valid number. If we have 30 customers and we put 10,000 in there, the program should be able to handle it. And that's what the author is saying in here. So notice, customer ID must be an integer if you put something non-integer. Database error, that would be if you put in a number that was out of range. All right. Okay, so I think this is a good place to stop. It says I've got about 7 or 8 more minutes on here, but let's come back and we will look at this enhanced customer application after the break. It's about 8:35. I'm going to just give you 10 minutes, so I'm sure I've got time to set everything up, and I'm going to try to see if I can sync back up to my database. So let's come back, please, at 8:45. I'll see you then.